Hello, it is Cameron again, and today we are going to be talking about the ocean tides and the moon. So, every day, every 24 hours, the Earth has two high tides and two low tides. Why is this? Think about this for a second. So, the Earth and the moon exert a gravitational force on each other. This causes the moon to pull or attract the Earth's ocean to the side of the moon, causing a bulge of water. However, why is there another bulge of water on the opposite side of the moon? So here's the Earth, there's a bulge of water here and a bulge of water here. Why are there two when there's only the moon on one side? Well, the moon's gravitational force attracts the Earth, not just the ocean. So the Earth also moves towards the moon and centers it, creating two bulges of water. However, because the center of the Earth is farther away than the ocean, it experiences a weaker force. So originally, there's the Earth here, the moon here, and a bulge of water here. But then the moon, as you can see in the image, also takes the Earth and centers it, so then there's water all around, with two bulges on each side. Lastly, the water on the opposite bulge, which is the furthest away from the moon, has the weakest attraction. So the water on the side farthest away from the moon also experiences a little force, but it's much more relevant than the force on the water on the side of the moon because it's so far away. So, as Earth completes a full rotation in 24 hours, it has two high tides and two low tides. Now, this image right here was taken at the Bay of Fundy in Canada, and this is high tide versus low tide, which is a 6-hour difference. So in this bay, they experience some of the most extreme high and low tides, as you can see in the image, but that's not always the case around the whole world. Just in this bay, they are known for having extreme high and low tides. So there are types of tides. So what are spring and neap tides? A neap tide is when the difference between the high tide and the low tide is the lowest. So if you went to the beach during high tide and you noticed where the water level was, and then 6 hours later you came back, it wouldn't be that drastically different. You wouldn't automatically notice, oh my gosh, the water is so much lower. However, on a spring tide, the difference between high and low tide is the most extreme. So if you went to the beach at high tide and you came back 6 hours later and it was low tide, you could tell a very drastic difference between the water line on the beach. So what causes these spring and neap tides? Well, in addition to the moon, the sun also has a gravitational force on the Earth. But it is slightly weaker because the sun is so much farther away from the Earth than the moon is. So, when the sun, moon, and Earth all line up, the gravitational pull of the sun and moon are working together, creating extreme tides, or spring tides. So you have the Earth here, the moon here, and the sun here, and they're all pulling it one way, which creates large, sharp bulges of water and very thin low tide. So there's going to be a very high tide, a very low tide, very high tide, and then at the bottom, very low tide until you're very high tide again. And then a neap tide is when the pull of the sun and the moon are at a 90-degree angle. So here, the gravitational forces work against each other, which creates smaller tides. So basically, you have the Earth here, and you have the moon here, and the sun here. So they're pulling at different directions, which in the end are working against each other, making less significant tides. And as you can see here, in this image, these arrows are pointing the same direction, which will sharply point the bulge of water like this and have very little water on these sides. So you'll have a high tide, low tide, high tide, low tide. But here you can see the sun is pulling this way and the moon are pulling on the opposite directions. And so you'll kind of have slight high tide, slight low tide, slight high tide, slight low tide. And this is also depicted over here where the moon and the sun are working against each other, which in the end creates less significant tides. this is also apparent in this image as well. So, another thing that you should find interesting, which I know I find interesting a lot, especially if you're a surfer or you go to the beach a lot, is you should check out some tide charts. I know that they come in calendar forms, which what my family does. We buy the calendar of tide charts, so we always have it up in the house. But you can find these all over the internet, and basically, they're graphings of the predicted tides for the whole month. And down here, I know it's blurry in this image, but there is times of day that you'll be able to see here. And so, for example, the difference between the valleys and the peaks on this kind of strip of days here is a lot more significant than, let's say, on the March 1st, 2nd, 3rd of 2020. And so here we had more significant tides, and here the tides were a lot less significant. So here is possible neap tide, and here is a possible spring tide.